Alright, let's get started with Lesson 4, Atomic Spectra. Alright, before we get into atomic spectra, let's just do a quick review over the nature of light. Is light a wave or is it a particle? Well, from what we know and understand, according to quantum theory, is that light is both a wave and it is a particle, and it's neither, and it's both, and it's one or the other, okay? In other words, we really don't truly understand or grasp the true nature of light. We know this, and this is what we do understand, is that in some experiments, light behaves like an electromagnetic wave, and in other experiments, light behaves like a particle. So there seems to be a duality or dual nature to the particle and wave nature of light. And so at this point, that's pretty much what we know and understand. All right, atomic spectra now. This atomic spectra is another experiment that was conducted that further places some contradictive information about classical physics and really further supports the quantum idea of light. All right, and even really the quantum idea involving in atoms. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this experiment and atomic spectra and what we do. Okay, so when we take light from an electrically excited gaseous atoms. Okay, so in other words, we're going to take an element, we're going to make sure it's in the gas state, and we're going to basically zap those gas atoms with electricity, and as the atom, when that light from the electrically excited gaseous atoms passes through a slit and is reflected by a prism, it does not create a continuous spectrum or a rainbow as sunlight does. Instead, it creates a line spectrum or an atomic spectra. A line spectra is a series of fine lines at specific frequencies separated by black spaces. Now, these excited gases create a discontinuous spectrum of light instead of a continuous spectrum, and this was very puzzling for scientists. A discontinuous spectrum indicates that atoms that are excited can only emit certain wavelengths of light. So it's sounding more and more like quantum theory here, where atoms can only seem to emit certain wavelengths or certain frequencies of light. Okay, so what did scientists expect would happen? Well, they expected that when you electrically pass electricity through gaseous atoms, that the atoms would emit light as a continuous spectrum, where there would be no gaps in the rainbow or the spectrum. All right. So as you see here in the next page here, we have a continuous spectrum, and this is essentially what they thought they would get from these atoms when they were excited with electricity. But instead, these scientists saw not a continuous spectrum, but a line spectrum, an atomic spectrum, or sometimes known as an emission spectrum, like we see here. And instead of seeing all the colors, we're only seeing some colors that are being emitted by atoms, or only specific wavelengths that are being emitted by atoms. So for instance, this emission spectrum or line spectrum tells us that the atom is emitting some red light, some yellow, a couple of green bands, a blue, and a deeper blue bands. All right? And so that's the only colors that this particular atom can emit. And so it's a discontinuous spectrum because it doesn't contain all the colors as we see in a continuous spectrum. So what does this mean? How can we explain all of this? Well, the explanation to line spectra or atomic spectra is going to come with the understanding of quantum physics, or the quantum idea, which we're going to talk a little bit more about when we get into the Bohr model, which is our next lesson. So right now I just want to focus on a few principles of atomic spectra that you need to know for the quiz, and will prepare you to understand Bohr's model a little bit. All right, so here's our experiment, little setup. We have what is known as a gas discharge tube. A gas discharge tube contains an element that's in the gas state. And what we do is we're going to zap that gas discharge tube with electricity. That electricity then excites the atoms, causing them to emit light. That light is then directed through a slit, and then is directed right through a prism, and then the prism, as we know, bends the light into its appropriate wavelengths, okay? Like so, bends it. As a result, we get a line spectrum that you see right here. This is the line spectrum for hydrogen. Now again, what they assume what would have happened under classical physics is that we would get a continuous spectrum. We should see all the wavelengths of visible light instead of individual wavelengths that we see here. So for hydrogen, I will expect you to know the line spectrum for hydrogen, and you need to know this for the quiz that you're going to take over this lesson. So hydrogen has the ability to emit 4 different colors, or in other words, 4 different wavelengths of light. It can emit a wavelength of red light at 656.2 nanometers, kind of a blue-greenish light. We mainly call it blue, but a blue-greenish light at 486.1 nanometers, and then 2 violet lights, one at 434 nanometers and one at 410 nanometers. All right. Now you don't need to know the wavelengths, but I do expect you to know the 4 colors. So red, blue, green, blue, violet, or just violet, and then the other violet. Okay. So when the hydrogen atom is excited by the electrical current, it produces the line spectrum, which is obviously a discontinuous spectrum. And this hydrogen gas is only allowed, that is, hydrogen gas is only allowed to emit certain wavelengths of light. It is important for the test that you're able to draw and label the line spectrum for the hydrogen atom, which we just kind of went over and talked about. Now, the other thing, well, just make sure you understand what the line spectrum for the hydrogen atom looks like, and that you can draw it and recognize it. All right, so here's a variety of gas discharge tubes for various elements here, and you can see as we zap it with electricity, those gases are going to emit light, and based on the most intense light being emitted will dictate the color that we actually see with our naked eye. But when we pass this light through a prism, that light is going to be broken up, and you're going to get various atomic line spectrums that we see. So these are the line spectrums for these following elements, and you can see for instance, we have lithium, cesium, potassium, sodium, and rubidium. All right, and if you look at these line spectrums, you will notice that one is that they're all discontinuous. None of them are continuous. All right, which the discontinuous line spectrum really reflects on the quantum theory being true, as we'll look when we talk about the Bohr model. But one of the things is that each one of these line spectrums for each of these atoms is different from each other. No 2 atoms have the same identical line spectrum, or in other words, no two elements or different elements have the same line spectrum. So line spectrums can not only help us to understand the quantum theory better, but it will also is a way of determining what element we actually have. If we see the line spectrum of an element, we don't know what it is, we can compare the line spectrum that we see to the known element or elements and determine what element we have. So in a way, line spectrum are often referred to as the fingerprint of an atom. So for lithium, this would be the fingerprint for lithium. And anytime you see this laying spectrum, we know that we're looking at lithium, and so forth. Okay. When we have an unknown spectrum, like we have down at the bottom here, we can actually line up the individual fingerprints of different atoms and determine what's in our line spectrum. So if you look closely, we can start kind of doing that. It looks like, if we drop that down, it looks like we got some potassium there. There's some lines for potassium. Any other potassium lines? Yep, there. Oops. Let's see. For potassium, we need these lines here, which we got. So again, line them up. You got some potassium. And oops. Keep on trying to do that. Okay, so there's some potassium indication. There's another green line that matches up with potassium. That lines up with potassium. That lines up with potassium. So certainly we have potassium in our unknown spectrum here. Can we find any other elements? What about rubidium? That lines up with rubidium. That lines up with rubidium. These line up with rubidium. So oh, wait a minute, we're missing those ones though. So they're not clear on that one. So we might have rubidium in there. Usually it matches up perfectly, but we definitely know that we have, in our unknown spectrum, we have potassium. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of this. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a lab experiment, and we're going to look at atoms and their line spectrums and see if you can do some identification and so forth. All right. Okay, so here we go with the hydrogen spectrum again. I wanted to show you this one more time because it's very important for you to have this down. Remember that hydrogen emits 4 colors: red, blue, green, violet, and violet at these particular wavelengths. All right, so you should always remember this. And the bottom line again, classical physicists believe that we should have got a continuous spectrum and not these discontinuous line spectrums that we see emitted from atoms. And so this just further gives us understanding that quantum mechanics, quantum theory is true. All right, we kind of went over this already a little bit, but real briefly, for you it is important to know that each element has a characteristic line spectrum. The specific line spectrum for an element is known as the element's fingerprints, just as you use a person's fingerprint to identify them. We can use the element's line spectrum to identify the element and how much of it is present. All right, and then this is our concluding slide. Again, it shows you sodium, helium, iron, neon, and hydrogen. All of them have different fingerprints. All of them have different line spectrums that can be used to identify an element. And again, the only one you need to know is hydrogen, and be very, very specific with it. All right, that is it for this lecture video. It's nice, short, and sweet, and we will apply this atomic spectra stuff to the Bohr model of the atom and further explain how the Bohr model gives us more of a quantum approach to atomic structure. So that is it for now.